Whispers from the past. He knew it would.
Well, my name is Denize, and about 15 years ago I realised through coming across my grandfather's First World War medals, the set of 3, the Pipsqueak and Wilfred, that was the first I knew that my granddad had done service in the war. So I started to look into his story. I mean, he died some years before, but I knew him well and I remembered him well. And I just remember him as a lovely grampy. He was tall and lean and would draw beautifully and always had time, to cuddle up and tell stories with. But I knew nothing about the war service, so it was a bit of an eye-opener. And it turns out that he was born in Wiltshire in 1892, but at about the age of 20, he was a farm labourer, a ploughman and a stockman, and no doubt was scratching about for work, increased mechanisation in the early 20th century and so on. So he'd upped and offed to South Wales to work on the railway, which must have been enormously more secure and well paid compared to rural agricultural wages and so on. But he hadn't been in South Wales any longer than about a year, 18 months when war was declared, and that was obviously August 1914. And then within a couple of weeks, Grumpy, despite his longed for secure job, he answered the call for volunteers, the Kitchener Army, and he signed up. So he signed up his attestation, I think it's called, in the first week of September 1914 and instantly was packed off to a training camp. He was posted into the King's Shropshire Light Infantry, which, there's absolutely no family connection with Shropshire at all. He was a Wiltshire man born and bred, and there was a Wiltshire Yeomanry Regiment, but not that one. And there were also Welsh regiments like the South Wales Borderers and so on, but not that one either. So I'm guessing that he was just put into the KSLI because many of those regiments were backfilling with volunteers after the regular soldiers had been sent out with the British Expeditionary Force. So just a fluke, I think, really. He apparently first went to France in early-ish spring 1915, but his battalion was there no time at all, and they were there literally a matter of weeks. He probably didn't even get out of the base camp Étaples or wherever he was posted, and then they turned that battalion around and they posted them off to Macedonia and to Salonika across there, which is just sort of north of Greece. And that was just from the bits that I've read about it, and it's kind of not sexy, it's not well written up into. Everybody thinks of the First World War in terms of the Western Front in France and Belgium, but you can find information if you dig around long enough. And I think it was a pretty sad sort of posting, because when you were posted there was never any kind of trip back home for 4 or 5 days on leave, which soldiers on the Western Front would have had when their turn came around. You went off to Salonika and there you blooming stayed until the end of the war. So conditions were really bad. Conditions were like the heat and disease and getting stuck out there on that peninsula, and then they saw sporadic action. But one of the nasty things was illness, rather than sort of being under heavy fire all the time. And I've managed to find lots of records of Grampy's ill health when he was sent to Malta on the SS Galaica, a hospital ship, and then he spent time there recovering from malaria and so on. Then off he goes back to Salonika, back to his unit, really horrible. I did that a few times back and forth, and no doubt that was in common with all those men. It must have been really abysmal conditions. And then he had illness again and was sent back to London. So he spent some time in a London hospital because he was suffering from neurasthenia, which I had no idea what that was. So you look that up, and that was a nervous breakdown, or maybe post-traumatic stress, you'd call it these days. And it was more than likely linked to a story that came down from him through the family, where he and another soldier were on a nighttime guard duty, being the armed guard over a food depot. And they had to sort of prevent anybody coming into this depot. And one night they challenged somebody who was clearly trying to break in, and for them to stop and identify themselves. And this person didn't, was either continuing to get in, maybe not understanding what they were being told. And both of the guards on duty, Grumpy and the other guy, they both opened fire, and this person fell dead. And when they rushed over and had a look, it was a woman. And it just broke him up. And he lived with that story. They never knew, so the story goes, which of them had fired that shot. But, I think he perhaps believed firmly that it was him, because he's very well known to have been a very keen shot with, both an air rifle for rabbit hunting and even with stones, and stuff like that. He was absolutely fantastic, a proper countryman. So he believed it was him, and it just wrecked him. And it made me think, that many people saw the most horrendous things and lived through horrific kind of events. But how many men in the First World War, how many soldiers would have killed a woman? Just so weird and so unusual. Even after that, he got posted back to his unit. Off he goes again, back and forth across Europe. And then he gets injured in the Battle of, I don't know how to pronounce it, it's either Doiran or Dwaran, which sort of raged in 1917 in that area. And he was shot. I think there were, in that battle, which went on for a couple of months, there were about 20,000 casualties, 2,000 of which lost their lives. So in that respect, he was lucky. So back he comes then to London again, to a hospital. But after that injury, he was deemed as unfit for active service. So he was then transferred into the Labour Corps and was sent, and this must have been like heaven, he was sent to work on a farm in Shropshire and became very, very close to the family whose farm it was. He worked hard and they treated him well, and he was close to them and so on. And that allowed him, amazingly, to marry my grandmother before the end of the First World War. They were married in June 1918. And so with his soldier's savings, and living on the farm, he bought my grandmother the engagement ring, which we've still got in the family, and that's been passed down and now belongs to my daughter. And I would love to have it, but it's not mine, just in my keeping. Then that was his story, really. All sorts of, maybe relatively commonplace stories, trials and tribulations, apart from the terrible shooting of a woman. And then, bless him, he had to wait his turn to be demobbed, and he waited a really long time. And I know that in principle that it was a case of the soldiers who enlisted at a very early date would be demobbed earlier, first in, first out. That kind of is fair. And Grampy did enlist very early, but of course he was already in a place of safety. He wasn't on the Western Front or in any other dangerous place. He was in Shropshire in the Labour Corps doing things with his beloved horses, no doubt. So he had to wait, bless his heart, until February 1919 before he was demobbed. Just the most amazing amount of time. And I think a lot of people don't realise that, you know, some soldiers, they didn't finish their service in November 1918. It wasn't like a curtain coming down. Some of the work dragged on and on. And I've actually managed, I've got the original tattered and split and yellowed soldier's demobilisation account, and you know, it's here. And he got paid 28 days leave furlough at the rate of 1 and 9pence a day. So 1 and 9pence for a day's pay. That's under 10 pence in modern currency. And he had 28 days ration, a food allowance at 2 and a penny a day. That's just over 10 pence. And a war gratuity. I think this is the saddest bit. He got paid a war gratuity for serving the whole well, in his case, more like 4.5 years service. £16. Just amazing, isn't it? All of that. So he walked away with the clothes he was stood up in and £29, 18 shillings altogether. Amazing.
Whispers from